And I want to, Zenny, if I may, I want to begin what I feel and find to be the most important thing. I want to start by offering my heartfelt prayers and empathy for the people in Chinatown, East Lake, and Little Saigon. We are all members of a united, beloved community. And when any one of us are harmed, we are all harmed. I want to add something else, speaking as a black male and as a black person, period. Our descendants, our elders and ancestors endured some of the most inhumane, cruel treatment ever in the history of mankind. And for me, that experience should always serve as a bridge to other marginalized communities. The third thing I want to say is why I was concerned about this, in addition to obviously the human impact, there's always a political impact. And a quick example, Zenny, like for example, a white male, Richard Allen Davis, who had a history, kidnapped a 12-year-old girl, Polly Klaas, kidnapped her, raped her, and killed her. That led to California passing the first three strikes law in the nation. However, we know since that time who that policy disproportionately impacted, and that's black people. So anytime there is an act of violence, and anytime there is a move or effort to politicize it, then as black people, we have to always be on guard as well. Because typically the resulting decisions does not produce public safety for us. It actually produces more harm and injustice. Once we get to the mayor, I've been very vocal in my criticism of her tenure during her administration. And this, once again, is sadly another example of her failure, a lack of real, authentic leadership. We need a leader who's going to unify the people, not devolve to finger pointing and politicizing these issues. And it's important to note, as you alluded to, in the black community specifically, the conversation I've been having with black residents is the frustration that the violence that has primarily occurred in our community, that's beginning to spill over into other communities, there's silence. I have not seen her a single time address people in our community to share any plans around what's going to make us safe as well. So it's a complex situation, and it's just being compounded by this politicizing, as it were. The purpose of that press conference was to address what was happening there. It was not about past decisions from last summer and throwing council on the bus. We need all branches of our government working together. Because on top of all this, we're dealing with a global pandemic, which has greatly exacerbated the social economic factors that existed going back to the crack pandemic. So now is not the time for division. It's the time for unity. And if this pandemic didn't teach us that, then I don't know what else will.
Why is it that you think that I read a study by the Urban Institute that posits a connection you and I have talked about anecdotally, that when people don't have access to money, when they don't have money, they get in jobs or content, whatever, jobs, but they don't have money, gun use goes up, crime goes up. And I don't understand not just why the mayor is not addressing it, but I have to say also Councilman President Bass, and that's something else Libby did not address Nikki as council president, which was not a cool thing, but that's, I digress. But also new Councilmember Carol Fife, they both jumped in, they made a video, which is also on Zenny 62, calling the mayor white supremacist. But my point is, no one is, it's like they have time to argue and throw, do sniper fire, but you have people, not just in Oakland, but as you know, but all around the country who are in financial trouble and are headed to the streets, and it's like they're tone deaf to the real problem, or they're afraid to address it or even try to solve it. Am I wrong?
No, you're hitting it right on the head. And if I may, I can go a little deeper. Let's start with City Council. City Council needs to do a better job. To be quite frank, they haven't collectively addressing these issues. And especially in light of, for example, when the shelter-in-place order was first enacted last March, I shared my concerns around what I saw, what happened. The rise in police brutality, a rise in gun violence, a rise in mental health issues. Sadly, all these things have come true. And let me remind your viewers, Zenny, that George Floyd was in the state of Minnesota, which was also under the Shelter-in-Place Act. The response I received when I shared my message and my warning was people should just stay in the house. That defies logical understanding of the economic, or let me say the social economic conditions and factors of many people, not just in Oakland, but across the country. What happens next? The protests. The same people who were saying stay in the house are now going out by the thousands protesting. Here is a real situation that a lot of people didn't want to talk about that are related to the protests. First, I've heard this for years in East Oakland, Zenny. Why do people always protest when someone's killed by the police? And especially if the person is killed in another whole state. Our babies are being murdered right here in our own backyards, and they're silenced. This isn't just from the government. This is from activists and community-based organizations as well. They also need to be held accountable to this issue. And I want to go a little deeper on the protest. Let me be clear. That is our First Amendment right. It's not the act of protesting that I have an issue with. We have to always be mindful of what are the unintended consequences. I'm going to give you 3 quick examples. Let's start with the police budget. Those acts of protest generated police presence, which ultimately swole the police overtime budget. We can't conduct activities that's going to lead to more police spending on overtime while at the same time saying we need to take money from the police budget. We have to be more intentional than that. Number 2, and this is facts, and I'm going to give you the third one as a clear fact. Every time there was a protest in downtown Oakland, the same day or night, there was someone being murdered in East Oakland. Why would that happen? People say, oh, are you blaming the violence on protesters? What I'm saying is people have to understand the subculture, the streets of Oakland. People in the streets learn quickly. If police attention is diverted elsewhere, it became open season. That's exactly what happened. You want a final proof? Let's look at what happened in East Oakland on November 3rd, the election night. 92nd and Holly, the street I grew up on. There was an organized effort to rob the cannabis clubs because the presumption was police attention would be diverted downtown as a result of a protest. It just so happened there was no protest. So police were actually, quote unquote, free to do their jobs. They interrupted that. Tragically, a young man was murdered. And there's video clearly showing that this young man did literally run a police officer over with his vehicle. Right. So I think it's important. We have to understand connections, the intersectionality of these issues, not just leading from a place of good intention, because as the saying goes, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Now I want to offer one last thing that's so key. And to your point, this is across the country. And it's not a coincidence to me, in my opinion and my perspective, as well as my personal experience, that the rise in crime and gun violence dramatically increased after the protest. I am connected to different people on the ground across the country, and there's been growing frustration between community residents and homegrown activists, and then when outside folks descend into a given city. In Chicago, for example, it was documented. The black folks there ran out the activists because what's been happening is anytime you create a culture of anti-police rhetoric, it has a twofold effect. The first is, and this is no excuse because they need to do better, police are human beings. I think people forget that sometimes. We seen this in Baltimore after the murder of Freddie Gray. Oh, you don't want us here? Guess what? We're not going to quote unquote do our jobs. And then when gun violence rise, then what happened? The residents who live in these communities under fear have no choice but to say, hey, come back. Because the activists are not doing the work of disrupting violence. You can't just label it or simplify it as just violence that occurs by police officers. You have to look at all of it. Right? So here's the thing that's so key, and this really, you're seeing this now. Keep in mind, January of 2020, we had one homicide. It's a 17-year-old boy that was around the corner from where I used to live. Last month, we had 15 homicides. The growing number of sideshows where people are discharging firearms. Why is that happening? This is the most important thing I want to share, Zenny. People have to understand this. The criminal element is not politicized in their thoughts. No one who lived in the streets said, oh my God, police killed George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. Let me start harming the community. No, the reason why is not because they are inherently criminals. It's because police brutality, for example, is just one out of dozens socioeconomic factors they are experiencing. So when a climate is introduced saying, or there's a thinking, a belief system that people want to get rid of the police in Oakland, that is drawing, it's attracting folks from outside of Oakland. These sideshow participants, 90% of them do not live in the city of Oakland. They come from cities like Fremont and San Jose, where the powers that be won't even allow these type of activities to take place. So we have to always be mindful that historically, Oakland has always been seen as the quote unquote dumping ground in the Bay Area, a place where people enter to buy drugs, to buy sex, and do all the stuff that they do. And then we get blamed for that as residents, as well as our beautiful city. So at the end of the day, I always share this. The Black Panthers understood that you can't just focus on the systemic and structural nature of injustice. They understood that you have to organize who they term the lumpen proletariat. That means the brothers and sisters who operate on the fringes of our socioeconomic order. Or let me break it down in today's parlance: the thug, the pimp, the dope dealer. If you don't organize these folks, the system and the powers that be would use them in their activities to introduce more draconian policies, including a call for more policing. That clearly has not been happening, because I'm on the ground talking to folks. And I'm going to tell you, as I wrap up on this point, it's different, the age groups. All the OGs, they come to me and they say, bruh, these people talking about getting rid of the police. Don't they realize there's going to be 1,000 homicides out here? But some people in the streets, that is a deterrent. For some people, it causes them to pause to think whether or not I want to pull the trigger and kill somebody. And absent of that, you can take the police out of the situation. I always said that's reactive. Who's going to interrupt gun violence? You follow me? Because there is unwritten rules in the streets of Oakland. You must retaliate. You have to, or your own will turn against you. So if I can't get you, I have to get somebody close to you, a parent, a sibling, a child, a best friend. You follow me?
Absolutely.
And here's the other piece of that, right? Because this is, I mean, it's a frightening time. There is a mass proliferation of firearms on our streets. The impact of COVID, shelter in place, mentally, emotionally, psychologically. We have a saying, hurt people. And sometimes these platitudes, they feel empty, right? It felt like something that's meant to console us. But we have to understand how people in the streets think. Because the young people have been telling me this. Not everybody young, but I got a lot of young people I mentor that's in that life. And they tell me this. Oh, what? They're going to get rid of the police? Oh, wow. I'm going to kill and rob everybody out here. Because we have to understand these are folks who are dealing with social economic factors, but they're not being organized or politicized in their thinking. We have to address both ends. It can't just segment one from the other, because it is a symbiotic relationship.
But, I mean, here's my other question is, you were talking about the sideshows. How do we get to a point where all of a sudden these sideshows sprang up